Why did medieval cities compete to build taller and taller cathedrals? And how did they do it without cranes, concrete, or even steel? Today we're going to talk about these medieval skyscrapers, why they were built, and how they were constructed. It's me and this is my channel. So if you've ever walked through a European city, you've probably seen these magnificent buildings. They have a beautiful architecture, but they are also insanely tall. So how did people in the Middle Ages manage to construct them? Well, it was a combination of faith, engineering, and politics that led these cities to attempt to reach heaven itself. So around the year 1000 AD, most churches looked like this, with rounded arches and small windows. This style would become known as Romanesque. But over the next few centuries, something interesting began to happen. People wanted these churches to be grander, taller, and more elaborate. They wanted their places of worship to express the idea of looking up to God. And so they began experimenting with new styles of architecture. And this brings us to number 1, the rise of Gothic. Gothic architecture emphasized vertical lines and large windows to allow more light into the building. It was meant to convey a sense of reaching upward to God, as one writer put it. Gothic cathedrals are all about transcendence, meaning they're designed to help you transcend or go beyond the everyday world to focus on spirituality. Now, at first glance, you might think that these cathedrals look kind of unfinished, like half of them are floating up in the air. That wasn't actually the case. These builders knew what they were doing. And part of this new style involved inventing new ways to construct buildings, which leads us to know 2 engineering breakthroughs. One of the innovations was the invention of the pointed arch. Pointed arches could distribute the weight of a roof more efficiently than the round arches used in Romanesque architecture. This allowed for higher ceilings. But the real breakthrough came when engineers invented ribbed vaults. These ribbed vaults allowed for taller buildings because they could be built with thinner walls. Not only that, but the pointed arches and ribbed vaults made the buildings more flexible. See, before this, architects had to consider the weight not just of the roof and walls, but also of any other stories above it. Since these new roofs were so efficient, architects could imagine much larger and taller buildings. But there was a problem. Walls can only be so tall before they become unstable. That's where another innovation came in, flying buttresses. Flying buttresses are these arches that look like they're floating above the ground. They were connected to the walls with these arches, and they helped to support the weight of the soaring walls. This innovation allowed Gothic cathedrals to push upward to unbelievable heights. In fact, it got so competitive between cities who were building the tallest cathedral that some cathedrals started competing with each other by adding more and more height. For example, construction on the Cologne Cathedral began in 1248. The plans called for it to be the tallest building in the world, reaching 157 meters. Construction went well until 1260 when building suddenly stopped. The reason was because construction on the nearby Strasbourg Cathedral began, and Cologne wanted to make sure they stayed taller. They didn't want to be upstaged. Building didn't resume until 30 years later, which brings us to know 3 politics and economics. The cathedrals were important to the cities. They were status symbols, showing everyone who came to town that the city was rich and powerful. In fact, every European city wanted their cathedral to be the tallest and the most elaborate. They wanted to outdo their neighbors. They competed for pilgrims along important trading routes. They also competed for merchants to set up shop in their towns. To get an edge, they tried to attract them with great works of art and impressive architecture. For example, Florence, Italy, constructed the Duomo. With its beautiful dome, it became a symbol of the city. It showed the rest of Europe that Florence was wealthy and influential. But the cathedrals were also meant to inspire awe in those who saw them. They were supposed to be so magnificent that they evoked a feeling of spiritual power, which brings us to know, for symbolism and spiritual power. Medieval people were very religious. They believed that the church and God were the center of everything. When they prayed, they were praying to God in the sky. So it made sense that they would try to build a structure that reached up to him. Some writers referred to cathedrals as heaven on earth. Of course, that's a bit dramatic, but it does illustrate how important the cathedrals were. They were supposed to embody the idea of transcendence. Stained glass windows in particular told stories from the Bible. They were meant to teach the commoners who couldn't read, since nearly all of them were illiterate. The windows were huge and colorful. They featured scenes from both the Old and New Testament. Altogether, they told the story of humanity from creation to Jesus Christ. Not only did these windows teach people about their religion, but they also served a practical purpose. The glass let light into the building, which meant that these cathedrals were brightly lit during the day. But building these monuments was expensive. It took hundreds of workers decades or even centuries to finish. So how did they do it? Well, it took a lot of labor, sweat, and ingenuity. Which brings us to number 5, labor. Constructing these cathedrals required a lot of work. Hundreds of workers were employed to build these structures. There were masons who cut and shaped the stone, carpenters who built the scaffolding, and artists who created the statues and paintings. The scale of the project was absolutely massive. Each cathedral required hundreds of thousands of blocks of stone, and each block weighed several tons. The construction required enormous cranes to lift the stones and place them precisely. Now, this wasn't easy to do, especially since they didn't have any modern equipment. It took hundreds of men to hoist each stone into place. But here's where things get really impressive. These cathedrals took so long to build that projects often spanned multiple generations. A cathedral was considered a community project, and people would donate money, materials, and time to its construction. Families would compete to see who could contribute the most. And even kings and queens donated money to these projects. For example, construction on Notre Dame took over 100 years to complete. Work started in 1163 under the direction of architect Maurice Lauder, but construction was delayed after a fire in 1191. Then in 1220, a different architect, Jean de Chelles, took over the project. He finished the main structure, but then he died in 1234. Construction continued until 1260 when it was finally completed. During that time, at least 8 architects worked on the project, as well as hundreds of masons and other laborers. These days, it's hard to imagine people working together on such a large project for so many years. We're all busy, and there are so many distractions. But in the Middle Ages, it was different. Cathedrals were considered a community effort, and everyone had a vested interest in seeing them completed. But not all cathedrals were built the same way. Some followed traditional styles, while others experimented with new ideas. Which brings us to number 6, legacy. While Gothic architecture eventually fell out of favor, it left a lasting legacy. The innovative building techniques paved the way for future skyscrapers. Architects realized that buildings didn't have to be low and wide. They could be tall and narrow. The Eiffel Tower wouldn't have been possible without the innovations of Gothic architects. And the same is true for modern skyscrapers. In fact, the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa, uses many of the same engineering principles to support its massive structure. But cathedrals aren't the only structures that humans use to reach beyond themselves. So what structures today serve as our symbols of reaching beyond ourselves? Let me know in the comments below. As always, thanks for watching.